Hey folks, tonight we're kicking off with something less mathy but way more useful if you happen to have no electricity, no tap water, or zero clue about modern plumbing or medieval survival hacks. So, before you get comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually like what I'm doing here. And drop a comment telling me which channel you're watching and what time it is where you are. It's always fun seeing people from all over the world joining us, probably while hoarding beans or something. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some white noise. Let's dive into tonight's journey together. Back in the medieval world, fire wasn't just a convenience. It was everything: heat, cooking, light, protection, and maybe your only friend during a week-long storm in a straw hut. So when you left the house, you didn't pack snacks, you packed fire. Enter the medieval Zippo, aka the portable fire kit. This lighter was a bit slow, smelled like sheep, and could torch your entire cart if you weren't careful. Here's how it worked. You'd grab a hot coal from your hearth, usually charcoal, and wrap it in dry moss, fungus, or punk wood. Then tuck it inside a hollow horn or a fireproof leather pouch. Sometimes it was wrapped in salt-soaked linen or animal fat to keep it smoldering longer. The ember could burn low for hours, sometimes all day, ready to flare up again with just a breath and some gentle encouragement. Kind of like your self-esteem after a farmer's tax audit. The whole kit was lightweight, reusable, and essential. It saved you from the misery of striking flint and steel for 30 minutes while pretending you actually knew what you were doing. Starting a fire was tough, especially when your tinder was soggy or your fingers were frozen into tiny, pathetic claws. Carrying fire meant you could wander into an empty field, set up shelter, unveil your mossy miracle, and with a breath and a prayer to Saint Smoky of the Ember, you'd have a fire ready to cook soup, warm you up, or put on a dramatic shadow puppet show. You could even pass a torch to your neighbor on their way to market, literally passing the torch, because nobody wants to be the person begging for fire at dusk. Socially awkward and occasionally problematic. Gerald, if you ever peeked in your pantry, it's basically a museum of vacuum-sealed ambitions. Jerky, beans, mystery cans from 2011, and enough freeze-dried beef stroganoff to survive a minor apocalypse and still complain. But medieval folks preserved meat the old-fashioned way: smoke, salt, and the quiet terror of having nothing to eat in February. Nowadays, most people think smoking meat is about grilling, beer, and a little BBQ fantasy, but in the Middle Ages, smoke wasn't for flavor. It was for survival, and not just any smoke: strategic, sneaky, stealth smoke. See, in many homes, especially small ones with open hearths. Meat wasn't proudly displayed over the fire like in fantasy movies. It was hung behind the fire, high up on beams, out of reach of animals, kids, and the nosy neighbors always popping in at dinner. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke drifted, slow and steady, rising through the house and wrapping around any unlucky chicken or pork you managed to snag for days, weeks, even months. The smoke dried the meat, killed bacteria, kept bugs away, and made sure your ham lasted longer than your New Year's optimism. This wasn't your pleasant applewood grill smoke. This was pine smoke and desperate smoke, thick, harsh, and full of attitude. After months, the meat got tougher, darker, and completely protected from rot, bugs, and unexpected invasions. Even better, hidden meat smoked slower and was harder to steal. Silent fear when there's nothing to eat in February. Nowadays, most folks think smoking meat means grilling, beer, and a dash of BBQ daydreams. But back in the Middle Ages, smoke wasn't about flavor, it was about survival. And not just any smoke. This was strategic, sneaky, undercover smoke. You see, in many homes, especially the tiny ones with open fireplaces, meat wasn't proudly displayed over the flames, like in fantasy flicks, but hung behind the fire, way up high on beams, out of reach of animals, kids, and those nosy neighbors who always show up at dinner. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke drifts, slow and steady, floating through the house and wrapping around any poor chicken or pork you try to snag. For days, weeks, even months, the smoke drays the meat, kills bacteria, keeps bugs away, and makes sure your ham lasts longer than your New Year optimism. This isn't your cozy applewood smoked aroma. This is pine smoke thick, harsh, desperate, and full of character. After months, the meat toughens, darkens, and is totally protected from rot, bugs, and surprise invasions. Even better, hidden meat smokes slower and is way harder to steal. That's crucial when you live in a village where not seeing your sausage hanging is somehow a legit security measure. And don't forget the bonus: while the meat smokes, the house stays warm and pest resistant. Nothing says cozy medieval evening like sitting under a smoldering ham in a room filled with smoke and hope. Today's players like defense at the perimeter. They've got motion sensors, tripwires, drones with cameras, and some guy insisting his dog can sniff out burglars miles away. But medieval folks, they had their own way to protect their stuff. Sometimes, even Grandma's spare apple pie was part of the arsenal. They could warm it near the fire, then use it to slowly radiate heat all night long. Clay bricks got placed in beds under cloaks or wrapped in wool and hauled around in carts. Basically, a medieval hot water bottle, but way less fancy, and unlike modern batteries. These never exploded. Worst case, they just gave up quietly. No batteries, no barking, no Wi-Fi needed. They called it a living fence. And yep, it's exactly what it sounds like. Imagine trying to keep your cows in and the neighbor's kids out without wood, nails, or yelling. The solution: build a wider wall. Living fences, aka hedgerows, were made by planting fast-growing bendy trees like willows, hawthorns, hazels, or blackthorns close together. Once they grew up, you couldn't just let them get all wild and tall like weeds. Nope. You bent and wove the branches into a thick, dense barrier that could stop a pig, turn a goose around, and totally ruin a thief's evening. Not just practical, but stylishly aggressive. Some fences were made by partially cutting and bending living trunks sideways, encouraging growth while keeping them alive. Others used thorny bushes that blocked thieves and doubled as free berry providers if you had the hands of a professional bruiser. And that's the beauty of it. These living fences only got tougher with age, unlike wooden fences that rot, collapse, and invite every carpenter in town to give you a quote. Hedgerows just grew thicker, denser, and harder to break through every year. Medieval farmers weren't just building fences, they were making fortresses, plus, they doubled as multitaskers. Birds nested in them, pollinators loved them, and they stopped soil erosion, basically. Medieval Swiss army tools. If your multi-tool had thorns, bees, and sometimes a lurking weasel, that's pretty impressive. Some hedgerows in England today are over 700 years old, outlasting wars, kings, and several Brexit attempts. When you hear clay battery, you might picture monks in pointy hats zapping frogs, or medieval farmers accidentally inventing Tesla. Nope. This battery has nothing to do with electricity. It's all about temperature control way before thermostats, mini fridges, or climate anxiety existed. Clay wasn't just for pottery, sculptures, and kindergartens. In medieval times, it was an unsung genius of thermal mass, a fancy way of saying it could hold heat or cold, like a stubborn old granny holding a grudge. Let's break it down. Medieval houses and food pits often used clay-lined pots or walls to regulate temperature. In summer, clay kept food cooler than the air around it. In winter, it held heat longer than most building materials. Not sci-fi, just physics with mud. People stored milk, butter, or stews in unglazed clay pots soaked in water. As water evaporated from the porous surface, it cooled the inside, like a medieval fridge, but cheaper, quieter, and less likely to make your leftovers taste like Freon. Some even buried these pots in cool cellars or shady pits, where underground temps kept food, drinks, and sometimes Grandma's backup apple pie fresh. They could also heat them near a fire, then use them to slowly radiate warmth all night. Clay bricks were placed in beds under cloaks or wrapped in wool and hauled around on carts. Medieval hot water bottles, but way more low-key, and unlike modern batteries, these never exploded. Worst case, they just gave up quietly and stopped working. If you've ever cursed a pan because your egg stuck to it, you might love Teflon. But if you lived in medieval times, way before non-stick coatings and late-night commercials, you'd rely on something way simpler and more blister-inducing, the friction glaze. If you've ever cursed a pan for eggs sticking like glue, you might like Teflon. But if you lived in the Middle Ages long before non-stick coatings and late-night TV ads, you had to rely on something way simpler and blister-inducing friction glaze. Yep, medieval folks actually hand-polished their cookware to create a smoother, semi-durable surface that helped food not stick. No magic, not perfect, but surprisingly effective, especially if your expectations have been shattered a lifetime ago. Disappointed by cabbage. Here's how it works. Pottery, especially cooking pots, was made from stuck to your pan. Then you might be into Teflon. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, way before non-stick coatings and late-night TV ads, you'd be relying on something way simpler and way more blister-inducing. called friction glaze. Yep, medieval folks actually polished their cookware by hand to create a smooth, semi-durable surface that helped food not stick. No magic here, and definitely not perfect, but surprisingly effective, especially if your biggest disappointment has been a lifetime of cabbage. Here's how it worked. Pottery, especially cooking pots, was usually made from raw clay that was about as non-stick as sandpaper, but by rubbing damp pots with smooth stones, bone tools, or even hardwoods, they compressed the surface, aligned particles, and sealed pores. This painstaking polishing created a subtle shine called friction glaze. Imagine someone spending half a day polishing cookware, massaging a soup pot like it owed them money. That's friction glaze for you. So, does this stop everything from sticking? Nope, not magic. It's a medieval hack. But it cut down food sticking enough to make cleaning easier and stews less likely to burn. Some folks even slathered a thin layer of animal fat on polished pots and fired them to seal the surface, a prehistoric seasoning ritual. It also made pots tougher by making them water resistant and less crack prone. Bonus points, polished pots looked way cooler, back when most stuff was gray, wooden, or rotting. A shiny cooking pot was basically medieval kitchen bling. Sure, this took a lot of elbow grease and probably gave potters chronic shoulder pain, but it made the difference between a usable cooking vessel and a container that turned your stew into plaster. Modern folks might drop hundreds on titanium cookware or some miracle nonstick, but medieval people just sat down, grabbed a stone, and rubbed until the pot obeyed. Primitive, yes. Effective, absolutely. Long before GPS, Google Maps, and that one friend who swears he knows a shortcut, but totally doesn't. People had to navigate by ear, especially in fog or forests, or those charming medieval mornings when the fog was so thick you couldn't see your own wheels. Enter the lost art of sound-based navigation, not a superpower, not bat sonar, just practical survival by careful listening. Honestly, we don't give our ancestors enough credit here. They could find their village by the angle of church bells and judge how lost they were by how many dogs were barking. Imagine you're walking. No compass, no landmarks, just fog, muds, and a deep suspicion that you're walking in circles. You listen to the bells, church bells, cowbells, even claps or gongs placed strategically in some areas. Towns often rang church bells, not just for mass but as sonic lighthouses. The sound cut through the fog, reminding you civilization was still out there somewhere. Herd animals often wore bells on cows or sheep, not just so you could find them if they wandered off and caused trouble, but so you could track the noise back home, making sure you didn't accidentally join the wrong herd and end up back in Gerald's pasture. Sometimes, in forests and mountain passes, people hung wind chimes, bells, or drums on trees to mark trails. The sound of the wind meant you were going the right way, or at least the way someone had gone before and survived. Fishermen used conch shells and echoes to find harbor entrances. Travelers would shout, clap, or bang sticks to estimate distance by echo response, Basic sonar, no scuba gears needed. Even taverns helped out. Many had musicians or noisy gossip spreading down the street like a lit up beer beacon, signaling safety. Follow the spoils. You'd find warmth, food, and maybe your cousin passed out on a bench. If you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to keep your teeth from falling out early, there was only one way: charcoal. Not toothpaste, not floss, just burnt wood. Medieval folks didn't have Colgate. What they had was wood turned to powder, mixed with salt, dried herbs, lighting up the streets like a beer-fueled lighthouse of safety. Follow the loot, and you'll find warmth, food, and maybe your cousin passed out on a bench. If you live in the Middle Ages and want to keep your teeth from falling out early, there's only one way: charcoal, not toothpaste, no floss, just burnt stuff. Medieval folks didn't exactly have Colgate. What they did have was wood burnt to powder and mixed with salt, dried herbs, or crushed shells, applied directly to teeth with fingers, sticks, or in fancy cases, wrapped in cloth tied to a twig. This rustic mix became a tooth cleaner that polished enamel, scraped off food gunk, and could delay full tooth decay until your 40s. Trendy, using a rag tied to a stick, this rustic mix became a sort of toothpaste that could polish enamel, remove food plaque, and maybe delay full-on tooth rot until you hit your 40s. Now, was it pleasant? Not even close. Rubbing dusty ash on your teeth felt exactly like chewing sand around a campfire. But hey, it was better than letting plaque run wild until your gums staged a full-on rebellion. Charcoal also had mild antibacterial properties, meaning it helped fight bad breath, possibly in medieval times. Fresh breath meant you could actually hold a conversation within 3 feet. Some recipes tossed in mint, rosemary, or sage not to boost the effect, but to add a clean vibe. Others rinsed with vinegar, which kinda ruined the charcoal's magic and just chipped away at your enamel faster. When dental care went south, it was time for pliers, strong arms, and zero anesthesia. Yeah, slapping ash on a wound suddenly looked like a brilliant idea. Today, activated charcoal is back in toothpaste and hipster spa treatments. But medieval folks weren't jumping on trends. They used it because their only other option was to call Bartholomew the guy who sharpened knives and pulled teeth. Honestly, modern houses are mostly drywall, concrete, and IKEA furniture that might collapse if you lean on them wrong. But medieval peasants built homes from sticks, mud, straw, and sheer optimism. This method is called wattle and daub. Sounds like a quirky folk band, but actually, it was the backbone of everyday survival architecture. Here's how it worked. First, wattle, a fancy term for woven branches, twigs, or long flexible sticks. Think basket weaving, but taller, chillier, and more likely to collapse on your goat. These panels were then tightly attached between wooden posts, looking like a very messy fence frame. Next came daub, a charming mix hand-mixed from mud, straw, clay, and animal manure. Yep, poops. Because in the Middle Ages, if part of it wasn't made from poop, were you even trying? This glorious mush got slapped into the gaps and left to dry. creating surprisingly solid, insulated walls. It blocked wind, held heat, and smelled like home sweet home with a hint of decay. But let's be honest, it wasn't exactly charming anymore. Your walls might crack, peel, or attract curious chickens, and patching them was just another weekly chore somewhere between not starving and yelling at your neighbor's goat. But it was cheap, effective, and most importantly, local. No shipping fees, no carbon emissions, just dirt, labor, and maybe a few injuries. As crude as it sounds, wattle and daub could last decades, even centuries if maintained. Some medieval houses still standing today have their original wattle walls, meaning some peasants from 1350 outperformed your contractor. Now picture bedtime in the Middle Ages, a lumpy straw mattress stuffed with regret, a leaky thatched roof suspiciously dripping, and a constant threat from fleas, lice, and creepy crawlies that bite, buzz, or just plain ignore personal space. Enter a surprisingly elegant solution herbal bedding, a rustic mix of aromatherapy and pest control, invented not because it looked cool, but because medieval peasants didn't want to wake up as a buffet for freeloaders. See, stuffing straw in your mattress was basically inviting itching, twitching, blood-sucking roommates. So smart households mixed pungent herbs like lavender, mint, sage, peppermint, and rosemary, not for luxury, but defense. These herbs were the medieval version of bug spray from Mother Nature herself. Their strong scents could repel fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and sometimes even your spouse. Some herbs, like marigold or moss, were even believed to ward off ghosts. Bonus, they kept nosy relatives at bay. Not luxury, but defense. These herbs were medieval bug spray from Mother Nature. Their strong scent could repel fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and sometimes even your spouse. Some herbs, like marigold or moss, were even said to banishing demons. Bonus, they also keep nosy relatives at bay. The result: a bed that smells suspiciously like a salad and can keep bugs away for at least a few nights. After that, you gotta freshen up those herbs unless you want a tick waking you up with anger management issues. And it's not just the mattress. Herbs were scattered all over the floor, woven into ductor frames, and hung in bunches from the bed. Basically, if you could shove a sprig of sage in there, you did. It turned. Back in the days before bug nets and electric lights, this was basically wizard-level home improvement. The whole manual spelled out exactly which herbs worked best. Some folks even swore their dreams got sweeter if they slept on a bed of lavender. Science, questionable. But hey, if it helped you forget your damp ceiling and that pillow that felt like a sack of oats, congrats. Long before fridges hummed in kitchens and freezers were stuffed with forgotten peas, medieval people had to get creative to keep their food from turning into science experiments. Enter the magic of passive preservation, stone cooling shelves, also known as slab shelves, pantry nooks, or simply a big cold rock for your cheese. Here's how it worked. Thick stone slabs, usually slate or marble if you're fancy, were built into the cool, shady walls of the house, especially on the north side, where sunlight rarely dared to show up. These stone shelves soaked up the Earth's natural chill and surrounding air to create a cold zone, basically the medieval version of a mini fridge, but quieter and with more spiders in colder months. They kept milk, butter, meat, and leftover food from turning into gross mush too fast, even when it was warmer. The stone stayed cooler than the air thanks to its thermal mass. Science says stone doesn't care about outside temps. No wires, no motors, no embarrassing blinking lights at 2 a.m. Just stone, shade, and pure medieval hope. Some houses even had full-on stone pantries or cold rooms with thick walls and dirt floors. These were the great-grandparents of modern root cellars, and they were usually tucked as far away from the cooking fire as possible. Sure, medieval folks loved hot soup, but they didn't want it turning their butter stash into a melty disaster. Rich households sometimes lined these shelves with damp cloth or porous jars filled with evaporating water to boost cooling. Smart physics without using the word evaporation. Poorer homes, they just poured milk on a cold plate and prayed it didn't freeze before lunch. Today, if you sprain your ankle or get stung by a bee, you grab an ice pack, pain meds, or maybe some gel promising cool relief and mild regret. But back in the Middle Ages, when medicine usually meant leeches or someone whispering Latin into a goat horn, people had an easier, less terrifying option: cabbage leaves. Yeah, cabbage. That humble veggie we now associate with school lunch disasters and boiled food funk once starred in medieval first aid. Cabbage leaf juice was used to treat everything from swelling and bruises to eye inflammation, joint pain, and sometimes the mysterious plague rashes. What was the logic? Simple. Cabbage is cool, it's soft, and has mild antibacterial properties. It's like a natural bandage prepackaged in leafy wrap. You'd grab a big cabbage leaf, preferably cold, squeeze it gently to get the juice flowing, then wrap it around the injury, usually secured with linen or a dash of hope, surprisingly soothing. The cool moisture calmed inflammation, while natural compounds like sulfur, flavonoids, and enough farmyard aroma to keep relatives at bay did their thing. Some healers even warmed the leaves, depending on the ailment, for chest congestion or sore joints. Warm cabbage goo was the medieval equivalent of Vicks VapoRub, just with more leaves and less mint. And unlike many treatments back then, this one didn't involve bloodletting or chanting under the full moon. This ritual was simple, repeatable, and required no trained monks or midnight sacrifices, just a cabbage and some. This ritual was simple, repeatable, and required no trained monk or full moon sacrifice, just a cabbage and a bit of patience. Of course, during hard times, those leaves might end up in your soup once you're done with them, which only makes you appreciate medieval toughness and iron stomachs even more. Before electricity, candles, or even the bright glow of solar lanterns, medieval folks had to get creative to chase away the darkness. And when torches were pricey and candles were for churches or the rich, commoners turned to something cheaper, stinkier, and weirdly effective: rushlights, aka budget bacon torch lamps. So what exactly is a panic light? Imagine a long, thin reed or rush, the kind you find in swamps. Basically, You definitely don't want to be barefoot anywhere near these. The reeds were dried, peeled, and soaked in animal fat, usually bacon grease, mutton fat, or whatever greasy bits weren't needed for dinner. The result, a slow burning, kind of flammable wick you'd clamp in metal and light like a candle. Not exactly romantic lighting. It crackled, smoked, and smelled like a bacon bonfire. But hey, it worked. And in medieval times, that was good enough. Each flame burned 10 to 30 minutes depending on how soaked and thick it was. Need more light. Light another one, want better light. Just lean in closer, and if your bedroom light went out in a drafty room, welcome to the wild, dark world of medieval living. But rushlights weren't just for light. They doubled as timers. Need to boil something for half the flame's length. Done. Want to know how long Gerald took to get back from the tavern. Light one up and count. They were cheap, quick to make, and surprisingly eco-friendly if you didn't mind the faint aroma of frying pork and swamp water indoors. Nowadays, we store butter in fridges, plastic tubs, or fancy wooden boxes. If you're pretending you live on a Victorian dairy farm, but back in medieval times, refrigerators weren't an option. So naturally, someone looked at a swamp and thought, all right, let's put dairy products in there. And voila, swamp butter was born. Swamp butter is exactly what it sounds like, butter, or sometimes pork fat. Buried in a swamp. Why a swamp? Because despite the mud, bugs, and creepy noises, swamps are cold, low oxygen, and acidic. The least glamorous fridge nature could offer, but surprisingly effective. Folks would take a big chunk of butter, wrap it in cloth, bark, or even wooden containers. Then bury it deep in the earth, not for hours or days, but months, years, sometimes even centuries. Archaeologists in Ireland have found swamp butter over 3,000 years old. Yep, some long-forgotten Celtic farmers' snacks are now museum exhibits instead of breakfast toppings. The cold, airless swamp stops bacteria and mold from spoiling the butter, and the tannins help prevent oxidation. The result, a strangely preserved dairy lump that brave modern tasters say smells like cheese, smoke, and regret-laden earth. So, is this the butter you use in your kitchen? Nope. This was survival storage, meant for winter rations, tribute gifts, or food for that cousin who always shows up uninvited every spring. Burying butter in swamps also had a safety perk. Want to keep thieves away? Hide your valuables in a mud pit, ankle deep. No one's gonna touch that. Mourning and all that. If you're picturing medieval folks chilling in cozy hobbit-like caves with rustic pantries and neatly labeled jars, think again. Food storage back then was less Pinterest and more don't let your food turn into a science experiment before winter kills us all. And one of the smartest hacks, hollow trees. Yep, the OG pantry. Grown naturally, no carpenter required, and already camouflaged. Hollow trees were all the rage across medieval countryside, whether from age, lightning strikes, rot, or squirrels getting overenthusiastic. These cavities became temporary storage for farmers, travelers, and anyone stuck with perishable goods and zero better options. Need to stash some cheese, jerky, or apples while on the road? Shove them in a tree. Want to keep your food safe from the neighbor's goat, or worse, the neighbor himself, a tree? Passing through the woods and need a chilly hideout for your suspicious liquid tree. The inside of a hollow tree offers shade, insulation, and natural hide and seek. Thick bark and a sealed cavity keep temps fairly steady and slow spoilage. Not perfect for long-term storage, but great for short-term, especially in colder months. Some folks even lined the inside with leaves, moss, or bark for dryness, and a sprinkle of rustic medieval flair. Others tuck their food inside ceramic jars or leather boxes before stuffing them in the hollow, at least fooling squirrels into thinking you're not serving dinner on a platter. Hollow trees weren't just about snacks. They also hid valuables, weapons, herbs, and in emergencies. Even kids during raids, not exactly a babysitting service. A good hollow tree could mean the difference between starving and surviving, or at least between suspiciously cold cheese and suspiciously warm cheese. In survival terms, eating bark usually means you've hit rock bottom, but in the Middle Ages, it was a legit food source. Meet bark bread, the medieval delicacy that screams, "I'm not starving, I just chewed on a pine tree." During famines, peasants didn't head to the forest to hunt or pick mushrooms because those were seasonally toxic, but to forage bark. Specifically, the inner bark or cambium from pine, birch, or elm trees. Not the hard outer stuff, but the soft, moist layer underneath. They'd scrape it off, dry it, grind it into flour, and mix it into their bread dough. Was it tasty? Nope. Nutritious? Surprisingly. Yes. Bark contains fiber, trace minerals, and complex carbs. It kept folks alive when grain stores ran dry. Taxes came due, and cows suddenly stopped producing milk, probably union strikes. Most recipes mixed bark flour with whatever was on hand: acorns, nettles, or if you struck gold, real wheat, then baked it into flat, chewy loaves that looked like bread and tasted like, well, forest. But when your choices are bark bread or becoming bark yourself, carbs win every time. Some even roasted the bark before grinding it to add smoky flavor, or at least distract from the fact you were eating a tree. And it wasn't just peasants. During sieges and brutal winters, whole communities relied on bark bread to survive, sometimes having to measure how much cambium they could harvest from communal forests. Taking too much kills the tree. Not enough villagers still tried. So if the world's ending and you're stuck in the woods with no food in sight, don't freak out. Just find a birch tree, channel your inner peasant, and remember you can absolutely eat that. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, beauty was a daily obsession. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't just groom, they made it a ritual. Cleanliness and makeup were signs of civility, favored by gods, and even political clout. You weren't just putting on a face for the world, you were prepping for divine scrutiny. Let's start with the eyes. Milk production. Possibly thanks to unionizing, most recipes mixed bark powder with whatever was handy: oak, nettle, even real flour if you got lucky, then baked it into flat, tough loaves that looked like bread but tasted like the forest. But when your choice is bark bread or turning into bark yourself. Carbs win. Some even roasted or toasted the bark before grinding it, adding smoky flavor, or at least distracting you from the fact that you were basically eating tree. And it wasn't just peasants. During sieges and brutal winters, whole communities relied on bark food to survive, sometimes even calculating sustainable harvest levels from community forests. Too much bark harvesting kills the tree. Not enough. But villagers did it anyway. So if the world's ending and you're stuck in the woods with no food in sight, don't panic. Just find a birch tree, channel your inner peasant, and remember you can totally eat it. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, beauty was a daily obsession. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't just groom, they turned it into a ritual for them. Cleanliness and makeup were signs of civility, favored by gods and even political status. You weren't just putting on a face for the world. You were prepping for divine inspection. Let's start with the eyes. Thick black eyeliner didn't come from Cleopatra's kung fu. It thrived in Sumer centuries earlier. Both men and women drew bold lines with kohl, a powder mix of lead, copper, and antimony. While this would horrify modern dermatologists, they believed it protected against evil spirits, and, more practically, the brutal desert sun. Their skincare routine would make modern influencers' pores look like craters. Crushed gemstones were mixed into oils to exfoliate and brighten skin. River mud packed with minerals was slathered on in thick, cool layers. Once dry, it was gently scraped off, leaving skin smooth and glowing. Yep, the first clay mask wasn't a spa treat, but an ancient science experiment. Hair removal was another adventure. They plucked, shaved, or burned body hair using sharp shells or ancient tweezers. Smoothness was seen as elegance and holiness. The shinier you looked, the closer you were to divine perfection. Even their gods' statues and priestesses were hairless, sculpted with perfect symmetry and big painted eyes. And don't forget the scents. Essential oils weren't just nice smelling. They packed a punch, or resin, frankincense, and cedarwood were soaked in animal fat and rubbed on like perfume. People believed these scents purified the body and pleased the gods. In royal palaces, perfumes were so valuable they were used as tribute. Eyebrow tattoos. Permanent makeup wasn't a 20th century invention. These rituals happened in ancient temples. Women used soot or natural dyes to draw bold, curved brows that framed the face. Impressively, that's beauty with commitment. If you think today's beauty's trends are extreme, let's talk about Cleopatra. Yes, the eyeliner queen wasn't just a seductive lady. She was the ultimate beauty icon of the Greco-Roman era. While her face was stamped on coins, her influence reached every apothecary and gladiator from Alexandria to Rome. And she wasn't alone. Roman women inherited Egypt's lavish aesthetics and cranked it up to 11. Let's start with the iconic milk bath. Rumor has it Cleopatra bathed in donkey milk daily, whether that involved 500 donkeys or just gossip. The fact remains, lactic acid in yogurt is a natural exfoliant. Romans eagerly copied this. Upper-class women bathed in milk, honey, and rose petals believing it blurred wrinkles and brightened skin. Spoiler, it worked. But your wallet wouldn't thank you. Now, onto the face. Roman women wanted pale, smooth skin, the ultimate sign you were rich enough to avoid the sun. Enter Cerussa, a white lead powder, super toxic, but perfect for a flawless matte finish. Women applied it daily in thick layers on cheeks and forehead. Over time, it caused ulcers, hair loss, and in some cases, death. But hey, you looked like a goddess. Totally worth it. Blush and lipstick were made from red earth, crushed beetles, or mulberry juice. The fresher your lips and cheeks, the younger and sexier you appeared. For eyeliner and brows, soot mixed with animal fat was the go-to, and if your brows weren't naturally thick, no worries, just draw them on, or better yet, tattoo them like they did in Mesopotamia. Hair was another battlefield. Roman women styled their hair into complex curls using heated metal rods way before your grandma's curling iron days. They dyed it with herbs, ashes, or even fermented leeches. Yep, seriously, all for that fashionable blonde look. Wigs made from German slave hair were all the rage among wealthy Roman women, flaunting status and style. And perfume, a whole empire of scent obsession. Romans rubbed oils with saffron, cinnamon, and rose into every wrinkle. Baths smelled like musk-filled botanical gardens. In ancient China, beauty wasn't about flashiness, it was philosophy. While Rome chased glamour, Chinese aesthetics prized balance, harmony, and stars jealous. Just draw it on, or better yet, tattoo it like they did in Mesopotamia. Hair was another battlefield. Roman women styled their hair into complex curls with heated metal rods long before your grandma had a curling iron. They dyed it with herbs, ashes, or even fermented leeches. Yeah, seriously, all to rock that golden hairdo. Wigs made from German slave hair were a hit among Roman high society ladies wanting to flaunt their wealth and style. And perfume's whole empires of scent. Romans were addicted to fragrance. Oils with saffron, cinnamon, and rose were rubbed into every wrinkle. Baths smelled like botanical gardens, soaked in musk. In ancient China, beauty wasn't about flashiness. It was philosophical. While Rome chased charm, Chinese aesthetics prized balance, harmony, and inner keys. But don't confuse subtlety with simplicity. Imperial Chinese beauty rituals were just as strict. Pale skin was the ultimate flex for nobility and leisure, while peasant women baked under the blazing sun. Noble ladies stayed inside, treating their skin like priceless parchment. White lead powder, pearl dust, even rice powder were all the rage. It wasn't just makeup, it was medicine, too. Court doctors whipped up recipes they swore would boost health or even extend life. But the real MVP of ancient Chinese skincare, jade rollers, yes. The TikTok famous ones were used by Han Dynasty women centuries ago, cool to the touch and symbolizing immortality. They rolled these jade tools over their faces to boost blood flow, zap puffiness, and keep youthful looks. Even emperors were said to keep jade pillows. believing the stone sucked toxins from their skin while they slept. Eyebrows were serious business. Women shaped and painted them according to fashion and politics. In some dynasties, long, curvy brows were all the rage. Elsewhere, short, straight lines pointing upward ruled the day. Ink made from burnt willow or charcoal was applied with brushes crafted from rabbit hair. Some trends even encouraged plucking off natural brows entirely and repainting them higher on the forehead for a better look. Lips were stained with a mix of cinnabar and animal fat, sometimes blended with beeswax. Blush came from powdered lily petals, dabbed in tiny circles on the cheeks, and those beauty spots totally deliberate. Some women drew tiny black dots near their lips or eyes, seen as symbols of allure and mystery. Hair care was a daily ritual. Women washed and nourished their waist-length locks with fermented rice water and chrysanthemum oil. High buns were pinned up with jade hairpins and golden combs, not just style moves, but status statements of elegance and cultural sophistication. For ancient Chinese folks, beauty wasn't loud or deadly. It was meditative, disciplined, symbolic. It was subtle restraint paired with quiet power, spoken not in words, but in the gentle glow of a made-up face and the perfect arch of eyebrows. If there's ever a time when beauty could literally kill, it was the Renaissance, at courts in Italy, England, and France. Women weren't just enhancing their looks, they were slowly poisoning themselves, chasing perfection. The goal, a plaster white face with blood-red lips and elegantly high brows. The recipe sounds like a dermatologist's nightmare today. Let's kick off with the infamous Venetian ceruse, a fancy cream made from white lead and vinegar. It gave a smooth white base, hiding flaws and wrinkles. Queen Elizabeth, I was a fan. By candlelight, it made skin glow porcelain bright. The catch, it ate away at your skin, caused numbness, rotted teeth, and eventually killed you. Basically, a Renaissance ticking time bomb. But wait, there's arsenic too, for ladies wanting lighter skin or to fade freckles. Arsenic cakes were sold like magic pills. Taking small doses was supposed to make skin look translucent. Side effects: vomiting, kidney damage, internal bleeding. But hey, beauty doesn't wait for your liver. Eyebrows were plucked into thin arches or removed altogether. A high, round forehead was the fashion, so women sometimes shaved off an inch or two of hairline to fake a bigger brain and, by extension, higher virtue. Baldness was seen as a status symbol. Cheeks got their color from crushed berries, beetles, or red lipstick. Lips were painted with similar mixes. Some women used mercury-based red dyes for a seductive hue with the bonus of irreversible nerve damage. Rosy cheeks meant youth and vitality, prized by nobles in an age when life was short. And the overpowering scents of amber, musk, and civet weren't just for seduction. They masked the raw truth under layers of toxic makeup. After all, bathing was still kinda suspect across much of Europe. Golden hair was the ideal, especially in Italy. Women bleached their hair with a mix of sulfur, soda, and lemon juice, then sit under the sun wearing a wide-brimmed hat, cutting the top to expose the hair It worked, but also gave them some crispy scalp action. Long before, modern skincare trends started throwing around natural like a buzzword. Ancient India already had this handbook, and it wasn't just about skin damage. This is Ayurveda, the science of life. Indian beauty rituals weren't just random habits. They were an extension of mental health, diet, and inner balance. Beauty was basically your vibe reflected through your hair, your core energy, mental health, diet, and inner balance. Beauty was your energy showing off through your hair. Let's start with the bath. Cleansing was sacred. Vedic women bathed in water or turmeric-infused milk, then exfoliated in a mix of chickpea flour, sandalwood, turmeric, milk, and rose water. It brightened skin, slowed aging, and purified your energy. No parabens, no microplastics, just kitchen ingredients moonlighting as miracle potions. Coconut oil, amla, Indian gooseberry, and flowers played roles like holy meds. Hair was the ultimate honor, has spiritual roots, made from soot and ghee. Folks believed it kept evil spirits at bay. Moms didn't just wear it themselves. They slathered it on their kids as a shield against bad juju. But hey, it also framed the eyes beautifully, adding an ancient poetic depth. Whole cities like Kanauj got famous for distilling attar perfumes made from jasmine, rose, and vetiver. These oils were rubbed on skin, used on hair, even tossed into baths. The goal not just to seduce, but to boost spiritual clarity. Scents connected your senses to the divine. Lipsticks and blush came from beetroot, saffron, and crushed rose petals. Teeth got cleaned with neem sticks and charcoal long before plastic toothbrushes made their ugly debut. Even oral hygiene was a moon cycle ritual tied to dosha balance. Probably the coolest beauty hack: henna mendi tattoos, decorating hands and feet, especially at weddings. Henna wasn't just pretty, it cooled the body, eased stress, and symbolized joy, fertility, and transformation. Every swirl in the design told a story. The ancient Greeks worshipped beauty too, but not with gold-plated glam like later empires. For them, beauty was moral. Physical perfection reflected a virtuous soul. A balanced body or symmetrical face wasn't just hot stuff. It signaled inner harmony, intelligence, and divine favor. So, no surprise that grooming in ancient Greece was basically a civic duty. Let's start with skin. Like the Romans, the Greeks adored pale skin. A white face screamed leisure and class. A tan meant you worked outdoors, basically tagging you as a slave or farmer. To hit this spooky ideal, Greek women smothered themselves in powders made of white lead, chalk, or crushed shells. These powders weren't gentle at all. In fact, some women wore mascara so heavily their lashes cracked when they laughed. But hey, beauty demands sacrifice. Lips and cheeks got their red from mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine dregs. The bolder the red, the more desirable the look. But moderation was key. Heavy makeup was a no-no. A little flush meant good health and purity. Too much was associated with Hedirai, those famous high-class escorts who used pricey blush and fancy cosmetics to entertain philosophers and politicians alike. Hair care wasn't an afterthought either. Greek women loved long, wavy hair, often braided, pinned up, or knotted with ivory or bronze combs. To lighten their locks, they rubbed on vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes ashes. Blonde hair was especially idolized as divine and otherworldly. Think Helen of Troy. Wigs made from northern slave women's hair weren't rare among the elite. Eyebrows were a big deal. A single, unbroken brow, yes. A unibrow was a sign of purity and smarts. Those less blessed by nature faked it with powdered antimony or soot. Some even glued goat hair between their brows, all for that soft, scholarly look. Probably the quirkiest was the henna mendi tattoo, used to decorate hands and feet, especially at weddings. Henna wasn't just for looks. It cooled the body, eased stress, and symbolized joy, fertility, and transformation. Every swirl in the design told a story. Ancient Greeks worshipped beauty, but not the flashy, gold-plated kind later empires loved. To them, beauty was morality. Physical perfection reflected a virtuous soul. A balanced body and symmetrical face weren't just attractive. They signaled inner harmony, intelligence, and divine favor. So, no shocker that grooming in ancient Greece was basically a civic duty. Let's start with the skin. Like the Romans, Greeks adored pale skin. A white face meant leisure and nobility. A tan, you were stuck outdoors, doing slave or peasant work to achieve this spooky ideal. Greek women used powders made of white lead, chalk, or crushed shells. These powders weren't exactly gentle. In fact, some women applied mascara so much their eyelashes cracked when they laughed. But hey, beauty is pain. Red lips and cheeks came from mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine dregs. The redder, the better. But application had to be subtle. Heavy makeup was a no-go. A little flush meant good health and innocence. Too much makeup was linked to prostitutes called hetairai, who used expensive blush and elaborate cosmetics to entertain philosophers and politicians alike. Hair care wasn't an afterthought. Greek women loved long, wavy hair, often braided, pinned, or knotted, secured with ivory or bronze hairpins. To lighten hair, they rubbed on vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes ash. Blonde hair was especially idealized as divine and exotic. Think Helen of Troy. Wigs and hairpieces made from northern slave women's hair weren't rare among the elite. Eyebrows were key. A single, continuous brow, yes, one solid line, signified purity and intelligence. Those not blessed naturally faked it with powdered antimony or soot. Some even glued goat hair between their brows, all for that soft, scholarly look. Perfumes were carefully blended, using olive oil as a base, mixed with herbs like vegetable butter, thyme, and iris root. They were usually applied after bathing, a Greek habit, often in public baths. Cleanliness was practically sacred, literally, in the jungles and highlands of Central America. Beauty was anything but gentle or subtle for the Aztec and Maya civilizations. Beauty was bold, a physical badge representing identity, power, and sacred duty. The ideal body was crafted, sculpted, and sometimes painfully altered to serve gods and social status. Let's start with the most intense skull modification: sacred duty and power. The ideal body was crafted, sculpted, and sometimes painfully altered, all to serve the gods and social status. Let's kick things off with the most hardcore skull modification. For both the Maya and Aztecs, reshaping a baby's skull was seen as an upgrade from early on. Wooden boards were gently but firmly tied to a baby's head to stretch the skull into a conish tilt. That shape screamed nobility, smarts, and beauty. The longer and smoother your forehead, the higher your social rank. Next up, dental bling. Forget whitening strips. Maya elites inlaid jade, turquoise, even hematite into their teeth. Tiny holes were drilled with obsidian tools. Then the gems glued in with natural resin. Talk about a sparkling smile. Literally, they had serious pain tolerance. Sharpening teeth into points or symmetrical patterns mimicked animal traits, symbolizing power or divine connection. Skin and face paint played a big role in everyday life and ceremonies. Aztec women often sported red and yellow powder on their cheeks, while both men and women used black paint for rituals. Colors weren't random. They meant stuff. Red stood for life and fertility. Black usually meant war or devotion. Some paints came from crushed insects, like cochineal, making a vivid, deep red. Piercings and tattoos were spiritual commitments. Ear, nose, and lip piercings were common, decorated with jade or bone jewelry. Tattoos, made with thorns and ink, showed family lineage, religious roles, or even battlefield honors. These weren't dainty accessories. They screamed loyalty to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixchel. Even cross-eyed eyes were considered attractive by the Maya. Mothers shook beads in front of babies' noses to train their eyes inward until they crossed. This wasn't seen as a defect, but a sign of mystical insight. Across the vast and varied landscapes of ancient Africa, beauty was as diverse as the terrain, from the lush Nile Valley to the Sava people of Nubia and the trading cities of West Africa. Beauty rituals were both practical and deeply symbolic. Decoration wasn't just style, it was a statement of identity, status, and even cosmic connection. Let's start with ancient Egypt, where beauty was basically a science. Both men and women wore kohl around their eyes, not just to look sexy, but for protection. The black pigment, made from galena or lead sulfide, reduced glare from the sun and prevented infection. The bold lines extending beyond the eyelids created the iconic almond-shaped eye look of Egyptian art. Eyes weren't just soul mirrors, they were sacred instruments, channels to the divine. Perfume was both a luxury and a necessity. Egyptians loved scents so much. They made perfume cones, wax cones soaked with medicinal oils, cinnamon, and lotus essential oils were worn on the head during ceremonies. As the cones melted in the heat, they released fragrance that covered hair and body. Daily hygiene included applying scented oils after bathing, usually kept in stone jars or plaster containers, artworks in their own right. Skincare was born from beauty and survival in harsh climates. Palm oil, shea butter, and castor oil protected skin from sunburn and dryness. These oils weren't just moisturizers, they had healing powers mixed with herbs. They helped heal wounds, soothe rashes, and keep skin glowing. Full body exfoliation was done with sand or crushed seeds, scrubbing away dead skin for ages. Before loofahs were a thing, in Nubia, hairstyles played a huge role in identity. Elaborate braids and shaved patterns told stories about tribe, age, and marital status. Hair was dyed with henna leaves or decorated with beads, shells, and gold thread. A big koi fish wasn't just fashionable, it was majestic. These oils weren't just moisturizers. Mixed with herbs, they healed wounds, soothed rashes, and, keeping skin smooth and glowing, full-body scrubs made from sand or crushed seeds have been clearing out dead skin forever. Before loofahs were a thing, in Nubia, hairstyles were serious business for identity. Fancy braids and shaved patterns told stories about your tribe, age, and whether you were off the market. Hair often dyed with henna leaves or decked out with beads, shells, and gold thread. A big koi fish wasn't just stylish, it screamed prestige. Further west, in ancient Yoruba and Shanghai territories, body art with indigo and red ochre was key for rituals and celebrations. Tribal marks, whether scars or paint, weren't blemishes but badges of beauty, power, and heritage. Of course, beauty always demands a price time, effort, and money. But in the ancient world, it could also demand your health, your wits, and sometimes even your life. Across civilizations, chasing perfection often danced on the edge of danger. While these rituals were admired and sometimes feared, they sometimes left scars far deeper than just skin deep. We've seen chilling ingredients like lead, arsenic, mercury, and crushed bugs all used in cosmetics and skincare. The common thread: toxicity. Lead powder in Rome, Greece, and later Renaissance Europe caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, and slow organ failure. But hey, the paler your skin, the hotter you were, a poison wrapped in a compliment. In ancient China, elite women bound their feet from childhood to chase the so-called lotus foot, a symbol of grace and obedience. Though foot binding got popular later, early versions of this torture, tradition, existed way before. The result, permanent deformity, but it wasn't seen as cruelty. No, it was beauty. Let's not forget the ritual pain of tattoos, earplugs, and body mods. For the Maya and Aztecs, jamming jade into teeth or reshaping skulls was a badge of honor, but infections, pain, and permanent damage were high risks. Similarly, in ancient African and Middle Eastern cultures, skin cutting was a symbol of strength and beauty, involving intricate carvings on skin, often without any antiseptic. Even perfume could be dangerous. In Egypt, perfume cones often contained cinnamon oil, which at high concentrations could burn the skin, and since water baths were a luxury, heavy oils trapped dirt and bacteria, leading to infections. Cosmetics and treatments were unregulated and unstandardized. One person's beauty secret was another's slow decline, and since many rituals were passed orally or written in secret texts, misinformation was just as common as vanity itself across cultures. The pursuit of beauty reflected The values of the era: power, divinity, nobility, virtue, but the price often came with silence. Scars hidden under powder, perfume, and elaborate hairstyles. Long before Monopoly ruined family dinners, ancient Mesopotamians obsessively played board games, especially one called the Royal Game, discovered by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s at the Royal Cemetery. This game is over 4,500 years old, but it wasn't just a dusty pastime tucked away in some corner. It was sacred, symbolic, maybe even cosmic. The game board itself was a masterpiece. A small rectangular box with 20 squares, decorated with lapis lazuli shell and red limestone inlaid with bitumen. Imagine something that looked more like a divine artifact than a toy. Players moved their pieces using four-sided pyramid dice to race from one end of the board to the other. The goal: get all 7 pieces off the board before your opponent. Sounds simple, but the deeper you dig, the more layers of complexity you find. Some scholars believe the layout symbolized a spiritual journey, a metaphor for the soul's progress through fate and chaos. The middle squares were thought to be dangerous or magical spots of luck, protection, or divine judgment. From this view, winning wasn't just about luck. It was about wisely navigating the cosmos, like threading a needle through the gods' wills. And speaking of gods, yes, they were involved. Clay tablets from later periods describe how people used the game for divination. Scribes would interpret dice rolls as omens. Using the game, how people used this game for fortune telling. The scribes examined dice rolls and read them as omens, treating the game like a sort of magical charm. Think of it as ancient tarot cards, but with the competitive vibe of backgammon. This royal game wasn't just played in temples or palaces. Versions popped up as far as India and Egypt, proving it spread along trade routes and captivated many cultures. Maybe this was the first international board game way, before chess or checkers showed up. For the ancient Sumerians, playing the royal game was more than just. It was staring down fate, testing the gods' favor, and maybe catching a sneak peek at the universe's secret blueprint. Yeah, it was a game, but also a ritual, a race, and a rehearsal for eternity. The Senate wasn't just a board game. It was your passport to the afterlife, played since 3100 BC. The Senate pops up in tomb paintings, ancient texts, and even on the thighs of pharaohs like Tutankhamun. For the ancient Egyptians, the Senate was more than entertainment. It was a ritual reenacting the soul's journey through the underworld, where every move on the board could echo into eternity. The Senate board had 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each player had 5 or 7 pieces, and the goal was to move them safely. Off the last square, the twist moves were determined by tossing sticks or bones, acting as primitive dice, but relying on luck alone wouldn't cut it. Strategy and timing were everything. What started as a simple pastime soon gained spiritual weight by the New Kingdom around 1550 BC. The Senate evolved into something way bigger than family fun. It became a symbolic act representing the soul's journey Through Duat, Egypt's underworld, certain squares symbolized key stages of that journey: rebirth, judgment, danger, purification. Each turn wasn't just a gamble, it was a call to divine will. Symbols around the board grew more mystical. Some panels were inscribed with hieroglyphs representing guardian gods or magic spells. For example, Square 26 often stood for the House of Rebirth, while Square 27 might be the House of Happiness. Landing there could mean divine protection, while other squares warned of delays or even danger. The board became a tiny version of the afterlife, spiritual obstacle course crafted from cedar wood and paint. The Senate was closely tied to the goddess Maat, who embodied truth, justice, and cosmic order. Playing the Senate well was a symbolic rehearsal to overcome challenges in the afterlife, where the souls weighed against Maat's feather. Win the game and you might snag immortality. Lose. Let's just say you'd better hope someone packed extra amulets in your tomb. So yeah, this might look like an ancient version of Parcheesi, but it's way more part game, part theology, part guidebook to the afterlife. In Egypt, you didn't just play the Senate, you prayed about it. For the untrained eye, knucklebones looked like kids' play, just a handful of oddly shaped bones tossed in the air. But in ancient Greece, it was no simple pastime. It was a game demanding skill, luck, flirting, and even sacred symbolism. Whether in the bustling markets of Athens or quiet temple courtyards, the clack of knucklebones against stone floors echoed laughter, rivalry, and ritual. This game was originally played with the tiny ankle bones from sheep or goats, called knucklebones, unlike modern dice. These four-sided bones didn't roll predictably, making every toss a suspenseful gamble. Players threw them up and tried to catch them on the back of their hand or land them in certain positions to score points. Rules varied by region and era, but the thrill was universal. Not just kids, adults, especially women, loved this game. Greek vases and sculptures often show young ladies playing knucklebones in elegant robes, a face full of concentration for many. It demanded grace and skill, a kind of ancient fidget spinner, mixed with social ritual. Sometimes it was even used as a flirting tool, where a smooth toss could catch the eye of a passerby. But there's more beneath the surface. The astragaloid dice were tied to fate and the gods. Each side had a name and number, making them perfect for both gaming and divination. A good roll could be read as a sign from the gods, maybe even a message from Apollo or Hermes. And if you rolled four of a kind, that was the coveted Venus. Throw a perfect breeze, so divine they said it was touched by holy favor. This game also had a dark side, death, and the afterlife. Finger bones were often buried as toys or fortune-telling tools in graves. Some believed spirits could influence them or help the dead predict the future. Eventually, the game evolved. Greeks started making finger bones out of bronze, glass, and ivory. But the core charm stayed the same: easy to learn, hard to master, and full of mystery. In Greece, Fingerbone games weren't just games, they were flirting, fate, and fun, all packed into one throw. If chess is the war on a board, Ludus Latrunculorum was Rome's declaration of battle. This ancient Roman game, often shortened to Latrunculi or Game of the Little Soldiers, wasn't just a time killer in the villa courtyard. It was a mental sparring match, a clever rehearsal for real-world conflict. To play well, you had to think like a general. The exact rules of Ludus Latrunculorum got lost over time, but enough fragments, boards, clay pieces, and literary mentions survived to paint a fascinating picture played on a grid, usually 8x8 or 9x8 squares. Each player commands an army of identical pieces called latrones or mercenaries. The goal: defeat your opponent and capture their pieces by surrounding them. No dice, no luck, just cunning. What makes it intriguing is its subtlety. This isn't a race or random chaos. It's tactical warfare requiring foresight and mind games. Players bait, trap, and ambush like in real military campaigns. Roman authors like Varro and Ovid mention it as a favorite pastime among soldiers and politicians alike. Some saw it as a test of character. Others just enjoyed embarrassing their friends in public. What's cool is this game wasn't just for the elite. Latrunculi boards have been found carved into stone, floors, even rooftops across the Roman Empire, from Britain to Egypt. Soldiers played it. While camped on the frontier, merchants fiddled with it during negotiations. The rival attacker. No one's quite sure how the moves actually worked, but this game probably involved dice or stick throwing, like other Egyptian games. What really tickles me is how quickly it vanished into thin air. Popular during the Old Kingdom, around 2600 to 2300 BC, it suddenly ghosted all records and archaeological finds from the Middle Kingdom. Why, no clue. Some folks guess its religious ties fell out of fashion. Others think it just got overshadowed by the Senate's growing power over citizenship. Either way, mayhem became a relic, leaving behind only snake-shaped boards and silent lone-headed pieces. Its presence outside Egypt is just as fascinating. Similar spiral boards popped up in Cyprus and the Levant, suggesting the game, or at least its image, spread through trade or conquest. Did it still carry symbolic weight abroad, or was it stripped of legend, reduced to a puzzle? No evidence. But the mystery only cranks up mayhem's charm. In the end, mayhem wasn't just a pastime. It was a walk along the sacred spine of a serpent, a metaphor for protection, risk, and the eternal cycle of life and death. Playing it, you step into a whirlwind where every move carries a mythic message. Long before Vikings carved runes or wrote epics, they played Tafel, an asymmetrical board game mirroring their harsh world of raids, sieges, and survival, from frozen longhouses in Norway to trading ports in Ireland. Tafel spread across the Nordic world, grinding both axes and minds. This wasn't light entertainment. Tafel was warfare distilled into strategy, deception, and calculated risk. The most famous version was Hnefatafel, or the King's Table, played on grids of varying sizes, mostly 11-11 or 30-13. The game's signature feature, asymmetry. One player commands a king and a small band of defenders in the center of the board. The other controls a larger attacking force on the outskirts. The king's goal, escape to a corner square. The attacker's goal, trap the king by surrounding him on all four sides. No dice, no luck, just logic, planning, and blunt positional play. And just like Viking raids, the odds were stacked. The attackers outnumbered, defenders 2-1, forcing the king's player to think like a desperate leader, dodging, diverting, and tricking the enemy. Taffel boards were often carved from wood, reindeer antler, or even stone, with intricate grid patterns and stylized pieces. Wealthier warriors might own versions made of glass or bone shaped like warriors, kings, or dragons. These portable boards traveled easily on longships, and though rules varied by region, they all beat to the same drum conflict. It was more than fun. Taffel trained Vikings in real-world leadership and ambush tactics. It taught when to retreat, when to sacrifice, and how to calculate multiple moves ahead. In an era where alliances shifted like winds over narrow bays, predicting your opponent could mean the difference between glory and death. Yes, the difference between glory and death. Tafel was so woven into Nordic culture that even Christian missionaries used it to connect with pagans, sometimes swapping the king piece for a bishop. But as chess spread into Scandinavia in the Middle Ages, Tafel faded, seen as an artifact of ancient gods. By the 12th century, the game was nearly extinct, though its echoes lived on in local games like Tablet. Yet, at its peak, Tafel wasn't just a board game. It was the Viking battlefield quieter, cleaner, and fought with bones instead of blood in the grand palaces of ancient India, surrounded by elephants, incense, and hymns. A game was underway not just for fun, but to decide fate. Pachi, India's national game, wasn't just a pastime. It was a cosmic dance of karma, kingship, and calculated risk, dating back to at least the 6th century AD, maybe even earlier. Pachi was the go-to sport for emperors with nothing better to do, especially the legendary Emperor Akbar the Great, who didn't just play it, he practically lived by it. The board looked like a giant cross, symbolizing the four main directions and the crossroads of fate. Each arm of the cross formed a square path converging in the middle square, representing the throne or the home base. Players raced their four pieces around the board, trying to get them all back to the center before their opponents did. The twist movement isn't decided by dice, but by tossing 6 or 7 mother-of-pearl shells. The number of shells landing face-up determines the move, so every step is a cocktail of chance, choice, and divine will. But Pachi isn't just about moving pieces. The point is to capture, land on an opponent's piece, and you send them back to start. Timing, position, and a little trickery matter big time. One reckless move can spell disaster. Patient strategy can control the whole board. It's like chess mixed with war and palace politics. And yes, this game was actually played for real, literally. Akbar, the big shot, built a giant life-sized version at Fatehpur Sikri, with people dressed in color-coded outfits standing as the pieces. He played from above, moving human pawns with royal authority. It was a mashup of performance art, ruling art, and spiritual art. The layers of symbolism in Pachi run deep. The cross-shaped board reflects the intersection of law, duty, prosperity, karma, desire, and salvation. Success demanded not just skill, but cosmic alignment. A good game, like a good life, balanced risk with restraint. Then the British colonists turned Pachi into Ludo, making the symbolism a bit easier to swallow. But the original game remains a masterpiece of ancient Indian thought. Pachi isn't just a race, it's a lesson on fate, patience, and the subtle dance of karma on a board where every toss means something. If you were Aztec, rolling bones wasn't just gambling, it was a spiritual pact. Pati, one of Mesoamerica's oldest known games, was part gambling, part ritual, and part cosmic drama. It was played everywhere, from humble village corners to the grand temples of Tenochtitlan, always under the watchful eyes of the gods, especially Mictlantecutli, the patron god of games, dance, and decadence. The board looks simple, a cross-shaped grid, often painted on mats, stone, or even carved right into temple steps. It has 52 squares, reflecting the 52-year Aztec calendar cycle, not a coincidence. Time, fate, and cosmic cycles were woven into every square. Players start with 6 bean-like pieces marked with dots, basically ancient dice. These determine how many squares a piece can move. Each player has a set of markers, usually stone, bone, or carved figurines, which they move around the board trying to complete a full lap before their rivals. But pole isn't just a race, it's a gem. Land on an opponent's piece, and you can send it back to the start, or, worse, knock it out completely. But danger cuts both ways. Some squares are penalties linked to bad omens, where landing means losing progress or goods. Yep, goods. Because pole wasn't just played for pride, it was a serious gambling event. Players bet everything from food and blankets to dust, jade, and even slaves. High-stakes games got intense. Crowds gathered to cheers or boo, and sometimes in priest-supervised matches to keep things fair and spiritually legit. Players often offered sacrifices to McQuilks before big games, begging for luck or forgiveness if they lost. Playing pole risked not just wealth, but divine favor. The Spanish arrived horrified. They saw pole as a gateway to vice and paganism. Gambling was banned, and boards were smashed. They moved around the board, aiming to finish a full lap before the other guy. But pole wasn't just a race. It was a shiny little gem. If you landed on an opponent's piece, you could bounce it back to start, or even worse, knock it right out of the game. Danger lurked both ways. Some squares were cursed. Penalty spots landing on them meant losing progress or goods. Yep, goods. Because pole wasn't just played for pride. It was a high-stakes gambling extravaganza. Players bet everything from food and blankets to dusting off gold, jades, and even slaves. High-stakes games got intense. Crowds gathered, cheering or booing, and sometimes priests had to step in to keep things fair and spiritually kosher. Players often offered sacrifices to McQuilks before big matches, praying for luck or forgiveness in case of loss. Playing, Polei risked not just your wealth, but also divine favor when the Spanish showed up. They freaked out. They saw Polei as a gateway to vice and paganism. Gambling was banned, and the boards were smashed to bits, but the games stuck around in secret or morphed into safer versions. What made Polei unique wasn't just the rules, but the mix of luck, strategy, and cosmic worldview. The board was a tiny universe. Each dice roll was a spin of fate, and every game mirrored the eternal gamble between order and chaos, life and loss. Nowadays, it's mostly seen as just entertainment, something to chill, compete, or kill time, but back in the day, the game was way more than that. Across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Central America, games were never just games. They were rituals in disguise. Take Senet and Polei, for example, not your average pastime. These had religious meaning, often played in temples, tombs, and sacred ceremonies. Archaeologists found Senet boards in Egyptian pharaohs' tombs not as toys, but as tools to guide souls through Duat, the underworld. Winning a Senet match wasn't about crushing your opponent. It was about proving your mental readiness for the afterlife. Similarly, in the Aztec world, Polei was played under divine supervision. Maquilo god of games and luxury, demanded offerings and strict obedience. Tossing beans wasn't just luck or bad luck. Those throws were messages from the gods, signs of favor or punishment. Losing your stuff, karma penalty. Winning a brief cosmic alliance. Even more abstract games like Mayhem and Poleis carried a deep symbolism. Mayhem reenacted the snake god coiled around Ra during his night journey through hell. Every move on the board symbolized protection, progress, or danger. Polei's cross-shaped design wasn't just about aiming center. It mapped dharma, karma, and moksha, the full spiritual cycle in mother-of-pearl shells and tokens. And don't underestimate the role of games in education and war. Ludus Latrunculorum and Tablet weren't just soldier entertainment. They were tactical simulations. Young emperors, generals, and nobles played to learn, not just win. Games trained minds to predict moves, counter threats, and balance aggression with strategy. Leaders were forged quietly, far from the battlefield noise. So, whether played in temples, chanted in courts, or carved in stone, ancient games wore many hats. Sure, they entertained, but they also taught, healed, judged, and prepared. They connected humans to gods, players to fate, time to eternity. In the ancient world, sitting down to play wasn't escaping life. It was living it deeper. Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin was born on August 30th, 1797, with a load of pressure on her first breath that most people never feel in a lifetime. She was born into an intellectual earthquake. Her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, were two of the most radical thinkers of their time. Her mom wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a fiery feminist manifesto arguing women are rational beings who deserve education and equality. Her dad was a political philosopher and novelist who opposed monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage together. They formed one of the most revolutionary alliances in Enlightenment England, and just 11 days after Mary was born, her mother died from the start. Mary's life was marked by brilliance and loss, raised by her father in a house overflowing with books, ideas, and radicals. She grew up shadowed by the ghost of a mother she never met, but whose voice echoed through her writings. Her dad didn't hide those works. He encouraged Mary to read them. Her education wasn't normal. She absorbed Greek mythology, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most kids could write a paragraph. The garden was her classroom. Her thoughts were nurtured by minds like Cage, Rousseau, and Voltaire. But this family wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. William Godwin eventually remarried, and ideas and radicals shaped her upbringing, growing up in the shadow of a mother she never met, but whose voice echoed through her writings. Her father didn't hide these works. He encouraged Mary to read them. Her education was anything but ordinary. She absorbed Greek myths, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most kids even knew how to write a sentence. The garden was her classroom. Her thoughts were fed by folks like Cage, Rousseau, and Voltaire. But this family was no idol. William Godwin eventually remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, turned cold and tense. The new Mrs. Godwin favored her own kids and saw Mary as a moody, stubborn girl with way too much imagination. Mary, for her part, despised the family's expectations and found comfort only in writing and daydreaming. By age 10, she was writing her own stories. By 14, she was reading books most adults were too scared to touch. She wasn't born to stitch doilies or sip tea. Nope. Mary was a brewing storm, quietly gathering power. Her childhood was built on ideals of political revolution, personal freedom, and feminism that set the stage for a life unlike any other. Her origins haunted by death, defined by genius, and forged in fire. She wasn't just her parents' daughter. Mary became something weirder and way more powerful. Mary Shelley, the future mother of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, 16-year-old Mary Godwin did something that shook London's literary world. She ran away, but not alone. She ran off with Percy Bysshe Shelley, a married idealistic poet, 5 years her senior, who was both her dad's biggest fan and biggest disappointment. What started as a romantic rebellion quickly spiraled into grief, exile, and artistic fire. Mary met Percy at her dad's house, where the poet often came to debate philosophy and gush over Godwin's works. But it was Mary, not her dad, who truly captivated him. Quiet but fierce, she shared Percy's passion for freedom, science, and the supernatural together. They read by her mother's grave at St. Pancras Cemetery, a place Mary visited to feel close to a woman she never really knew, right there among tombstones and candlelit books. Their love story began. Their departure was sudden and reckless. Mary, Percy, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, fled England and sailed across the English Channel to France with barely any clothes and zero solid plans. Percy had abandoned his pregnant wife. Harriet, a move that haunted everyone. The trio trekked through revolutionary France and Switzerland, journaling by day. The trio wandered through revolutionary France and Switzerland, journaling by day and crashing on flea-infested blankets by night. Their cash ran dry fast, forcing a shameful retreat back to England. What followed was a brutal downward spiral. Percy's creditors hounded them. Mary's dad, once all about free love, disowned her, and the kids started dying. Mary gave birth to a baby girl, but the little one died a few weeks later. She wrote in her diary about dreaming her baby came back to life. Woke up no baby anywhere. The grief seeped into her bones and never left. But through all this chaos, Mary's mind sharpened. She devoured Greek myths, alchemy, electric therapy, and resurrection science theories. She was living in exile, a radical woman in a stubbornly old-fashioned world. Her relationship with Percy was both passionate and exhausting. He was brilliant, moody, emotionally distant, but totally backed her writing. Mary Shelley became an outcast, but not a victim. Her life, full of rebellion and pain, was laying the groundwork for something epic. And in just a few short years, by Lake Geneva, lightning struck. Summer 1816, Mary Godwin, now Mary Shelley, found herself smack in the middle of one of literature's most infamous vacations. She was in Switzerland, staying at Villa Diodati by the lake, with her lover, Percy Shelley, her stepsister, Claire Claremont, the notorious Lord Byron, and Byron's doctor, John Polidori. The weather sucked. The volcano Tambora had erupted the year before. Ash filled the sky. Crops failed. Temperatures plummeted. It was called the year without a summer. Trapped indoors. This crew passed time telling ghost stories and debating science, poetry, and philosophy. One night, Byron threw down a challenge. Everyone must write their own supernatural tale. A creative storm was brewing, one that would change literature forever. Mary was just 18. Byron and Shelley were already big-name poets. Polidori would go on to write The Vampire, a Dracula precursor, but it was quiet. Sharp Mary who smashed expectations. At first, she struggled to come up with ideas. Days dragged by. Then one chat about galvanism, using electricity to reanimate dead tissue, sparked something that night. Mary had a vision. In her words, I saw a pale student of the arts, uncelebrated, kneeling beside the thing he'd made. I saw the horrible phantom of a man stretched out. She dreamed of a scientist and his monster. From that, Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, was born. The novel wasn't just horror. It was a mix of science, myth, and grief. Victor Frankenstein's obsession with creating life mirrored the farmer's passion for scientific progress. The shunned, unloved creature reflected Mary's own feelings of abandonment and difference. Themes of fatherhood, isolation, and guilt bleed from every page, drawn from her losses and the chaotic men around her. When Frankenstein hit shelves in 1818, it was anonymous. Many thought Percy wrote it. He penned the preface. He was the husband. He was the man. But the truth couldn't stay hidden. The world would come to know Mary Shelley not just as a poet's wife, but as the mother of science fiction. In one summer, she turned lightning, death, and her own pain into a monster that never dies. After Frankenstein's birth, Mary Shelley's life didn't stop at literary victory. Instead, it sank deeper into sorrow. Death was always lurking nearby, but after 1818, it didn't stop closing in, even as her creation entered public imagination. Her family started disappearing. Next to the thing he had made, I see a disgusting illusion of a man stretched out. She dreamed of a scientist and the monster he created. Thus, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was born. The novel wasn't just horror. It was a cocktail of science, myth, and sorrow. Victor Frankenstein's obsession with creating life mirrored the farmer's passion for scientific progress. The shunned and unloved creature reflected Mary's own feelings of abandonment and otherness. Themes of fatherhood, isolation, and guilt soaked every page, drawn from her losses and the chaotic men around her. When Frankenstein was published in 1818, it was anonymous. Many thought Percy wrote it. He penned the preface. He was the husband. He was the man. But the truth couldn't stay hidden. The world would know Mary Shelley not just as a poet's wife, but as the mother of science fiction. In one summer, she took lightning, death, and her own pain to create an immortal monster after Frankenstein's birth. Mary Shelley's life didn't stop at literary triumph. Instead, it sank deeper into sorrow. Death always lurked nearby, but in the years after 1818, it just kept closing in, even as her creation started haunting the public imagination. Her family began disappearing. Mary and Percy returned to England, where grief hit hard again. Their two little kids, Clara and William, both died. Clara from political turmoil in Italy, William from malaria soon after. Mary was crushed. She lost 3 children in just a few years. Endless pain, she wrote. Now I have no strength left for comfort. She isolated herself, mind clouded by nightmares, and her health began to fail. But amid the grief, a flicker of hope. In 1819, she gave birth to her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. In 1819, she gave birth to her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. The boy would become her rock in the years ahead, but even he couldn't shield her from the next gut punch. In 1822, tragedy struck again. This time, cruel and sudden Percy Shelley drowned in a storm while sailing off the Italian coast. His body washed ashore, unrecognizable except for a Keats poem tucked in his pocket. Mary, just 24 years old, widowed, broke, and utterly crushed. She'd already endured the deaths of 3 children, the suicide of her half-sister Fanny, the suicide of Percy's fiancée Harriet, and now the death of the love of her life. It was a gothic horror show no fiction could outdo, yet somehow she survived. Mary gathered Percy's remains, both literal and figurative. She kept his poems, his reputation, and allegedly even a bit of his calcified heart, wrapped in silk and tucked away in her desk drawer. Grief stopped being just a shadow. It became her endless muse, and through it all, she kept writing. The pen was her lifeline. She penned Valperga, a historical novel, The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic plague tale soaked in isolation, eerily mirroring her own life and sorrow. She edited and published Percy's works, making sure his legacy didn't sink with him. Mary Shelley didn't just survive tragedy, she absorbed it, twisted it, and spun it into art. Love shaped her early years, but loss would define her legend. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was as lonely as a young woman could get back then. At just 28, she'd buried most of those she loved parents, children, half-sister, husband. What was left? Her pen, her son, Percy Florence, and the crushing weight of her legacy. She was no longer the rebellious young lady who fled England for love. Now, she was a widow, a single mom, and a woman haunted by ghosts. Yet somehow, she endured. Financially shaky, Mary leaned on writing to survive, but Victorian society, not exactly a fan of women who'd lived too much. She was judged not just as an author, but as the scandalous wife of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to be tame, respectable, so she learned to navigate the literary world with care, balancing her rebellious past with the need to provide a stable life for her son. She wrote tirelessly, novels like Perkin Warbeck, Lodore, and Faulkner, each tangled with themes of political exile, lost mothers, and moral dilemmas. Not exactly Frankenstein-level groundbreaking, but they showed her shifting perspective, less idealistic, more practical, and deeper. She also wrote biographies, travel diaries, and countless editing projects, including the massive task of preserving and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same devotion she gave her own stories. But Mary wasn't just a keeper of memories, sharp as ever. She stayed politically engaged and fiercely guarded her privacy. She turned down many marriage proposals. She refused to publish rumors or spill secrets. She kept friendships with writers, philosophers, and publishers, but trusted very few. Her greatest devotion was to her son, Percy Florence. She made sure he received the best education, shielded him from scandal, and gave him the peaceful life she'd been denied. In doing so, she created a version of stability that had eluded her for decades. Mary's later years were marred by illness, recurring headaches, and paralysis in her right arm, but she never stopped writing, never stopped thinking, never stopped being the woman who faced pain head-on with ink and paper. She was the last one standing, not untouched by tragedy, but unbeaten by it. Her life wasn't just a Gothic novel anymore. It was a saga of resilience. By the time Mary Shelley hit 30, she'd become a quiet force in the world of literature. Not just a Gothic heroine, but a survivor rewriting her own story, the literary world, not because she was showered with applause, but because she refused to quit. She was no longer just Percy Shelley's widow or the daughter of famous radicals. She was Mary Shelley, the genius behind Frankenstein, a novel that, over time, started living its own weird little life. Frankenstein was initially slammed by critics. Some thought it was a creepy oddball. Others insisted her husband wrote it, but the public, they couldn't look away. By the 1830s, the story was breaking out of the pages. Stage adaptations popped up all over Europe, including the popular but totally wrong idea of Frankenstein's monster as a mute beast. A far cry from Mary's original tragic, eloquent creation, still, it proved the novel's cultural power. Her monster wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the world, and with that came something wild. A brand new genre was born. Frankenstein accidentally kicked off science fiction long before Jules Verne and H.A.G. Wells. Mary Shelley asked the terrifying question, what happens when humans play God? She blended Gothic horror with Enlightenment-era science, mixing human tragedy with wild imagination. This wasn't just a horror story, it was a warning. Mary herself never claimed to invent a genre. In fact, she rarely sought the spotlight. But today, scholars call her the mother of science fiction, a title earned not by design, but by sheer innovation. She absorbed her era's anxieties about science, ethics, motherhood, and death, distilling them into a timeless fable. While editing Percy's works and navigating a male-dominated publishing world, Mary quietly influenced generations of thinkers. Her books tackled politics, feminism, ecological disaster, existential dread, and ethical boundaries. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, imagined a world ravaged by plague and loneliness, a vision only fully understood a century later. Even though illness shadowed much of her later life, she never stopped connecting with the world through her writing. Her legacy began to spread, crawling out of labs, crossing stages, slipping into newspapers, and flowing into the bloodstream of modern culture. Mary Shelley breathed life into an idea that never dies, and because of that, literature would never be the same. Mary Shelley's life wasn't shaped just by love and loss, but by identity, a tricky thing she constantly had to defend, reshape, and protect. Being a female writer in the 19th century was a political act. Being Mary Shelley, daughter of revolutionaries, widow of a radical poet, and creator of a morally complex monster, made her life even tougher after Percy died. Mary was left in a shaky position, even though she took his last name through marriage. Her status as literary executor and guardian of his legacy was never guaranteed. The Shelley family, nobility through and through, never accepted Mary. They eyed her with a suspicion, saw her as a threat, and gave her a tiny allowance on the condition she stayed out of their affairs. They let her raise their son, but kept her on a tight leash. Mary played a long, careful game. She balanced respect and rebellion, crafting a public image that was quiet, literary, and proper, While subtly defending her radical roots, editing Percy's poetry and writing memoirs, she skillfully scrubbed his atheism and revolutionary ideas clean, making sure his works could reach a wider, more Victorian-friendly audience. Critics debated this move for decades. Was it betrayal or strategy? Probably both. Mary knew the politics of reputation better than anyone, but while she fought to preserve Percy's legacy, she also fought for herself. Publishers wanted her silent while editing Percy's poems and writing his memoirs. She carefully scrubbed away his atheism and radical views, making sure his work could reach a wider, more Victorian-friendly audience. Critics have debated this move for decades. Was it betrayal or strategy? Maybe a bit of both. Mary knew the politics of reputation better than anyone. But while she fought to keep Percy's legacy alive, she was battling for herself too. Publishers wanted her quiet, anonymous, or at best, just a footnote to her husband's genius. Mary said, nope. She kept writing novels under her own name in an era when women hid behind male pen names. Mary Shelley stubbornly insisted on being recognized publicly. At the same time, she sneakily wove political themes into her stories. In Lodoiska and Faulkner, she tackled women's autonomy, flawed fatherhood, and society's ridiculous rules for women. In The Last Man, she imagined civilization's collapse and the empire's pointless downfall, a commentary subtle as a brick. Mary Shelley's pen wasn't just for art, it was a weapon through novels, biographies, and quiet editing work. She shaped not just a generation's memory, but the whole framework of modern literature. The Victorian era bloomed around her. Mary entered her final decade with quiet dignity, overshadowed by physical decline and emotional isolation, though still respected for her smarts and literary chops. The world that once spun on radicalism and romanticism was fading, and Mary was one of its last living witnesses. Her wild youth, Byron, Percy, Claire, even her dad, William Godwin, were all gone. The revolutionary fire of the early 1800s gave way to Victorian restraint. Mary found herself lonelier, weighed down by chronic illness. She suffered brutal headaches, partial paralysis of a hand, and maybe a recurring brain tumor, yet she rarely complained. Pain became part of her daily life, like ink on paper. Still, she clung to her son, Percy Florence Shelley, who grew into a handsome, warm-hearted young man, unlike his parents. Percy Florence lived a normal life and eventually inherited the title of baronet, which he denied his own father. Mary held tight to his friendship, pouring her remaining energy into securing his success and shielding him from scandal, especially those lingering Shelley shadows. Even though her bold, creative days were behind her, Mary kept working. She maintained correspondence with publishers, friends, and intellectual peers. She continued to read widely history, science, political theory, still intellectually hungry, even as her body betrayed her. She kept editing Percy's works, carefully safeguarding his poetic legacy, while cautiously handling his more provocative pieces to keep public support. But darkness never fully loosened its grip. She lived simply, sometimes in poverty, and never remarried. Marriage to Mary was never about security. It was about passion and shared ideals no one else could fill. The void Percy left, and she wasn't about to let anyone try. In 1851, at 53, Mary Shelley passed away, probably from a brain tumor. She went peacefully, surrounded by her son and daughter-in-law after her death. Among her belongings were locks of hair from her lost children and a piece of heart supposedly Percy. Shelley's, wrapped in silk, even in death. Mary Shelley was the keeper of memories, a woman forged by loss, lifted by genius, and driven to write through every shadow. Mary Shelley died in 1851, but her voice never went silent in the decades after. Her works, especially Frankenstein, surpassed even her wildest imagination. What started as a teenage ghost story turned into one of the most influential novels in human history. Mary Shelley isn't just remembered, she's resurrected again and again. At first, her fame lingered quietly during her life. She was mostly praised for loyalty to Percy and editing his poetry. Her novels, though respected, were often dismissed or misunderstood. Frankenstein was still seen as a gothic horror oddity, its deeper themes ignored by a world not ready to ask questions about science, ethics, and humanity's place in the universe. But time revealed her talent. The 20th century, Mary's monster became a cultural icon. Film adaptations, starting in the silent era, and by the 20th century, Mary's monster had become a cultural icon. Film adaptations, starting in the silent era, and exploding with Universal's 1931 Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, gave her work a whole new look, literally. This creature turned into a misunderstood symbol of modern anxiety, a tragic figure born from human hubris and rejected by society. Each adaptation mirrors the fears of its time: war, technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, and always at the core, Mary Shelley's original stamp. Scholars started to take a fresh look at her work. Feminist critics championed her not just as a poet's wife, but as a true literary architect. They uncovered her sharp insights on motherhood, pain, creativity, and power. The Last Man, once ignored, got a fancy makeover as an early dystopian masterpiece. Her own life, marked by rebellion, smarts, and endurance, became as gripping as her novels. Today, Mary Shelley isn't just remembered, she's revered. She's called the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic lit, a trailblazer who mixed the personal with the philosophical. Her legacy lives on in classrooms, labs, film sets, and political debates. Whenever we ask what it means to be human, or what happens when creativity outruns conscience, we're speaking Mary Shelley's language. She gave us a monster, but in doing so, she stood up for every outcast, every orphan idea, every mind shunned for being too curious. Mary Shelley didn't just write a novel, she rewired the DNA of literature.